This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden, and this is a podcast where, since 2017, I discuss all things religion with a variety of fantastic scholars, experts, authors, and educators. On this episode, I got to learn about the impact of religious trauma and the effects of purity culture in religion, and discuss therapy and counseling with Indhira Udofia. Indhira Udofia is a Ph.D. candidate in the Joint Program in Social Work at NC A&amp University and UNC Greensboro. Their dissertation project looks at the impact of religious trauma on Black millennials and Generation Z, exploring the impact of institutional violence on gendered and sexual minorities within Black religious spaces. Her extensive experience providing therapeutic and spiritual services in clinical and community settings and faith communities shaped her passion for helping communities and individuals recover from trauma, especially in spaces of spiritual abuse and grief. You can follow Indhira Udofia on Twitter at Black Trauma Nerd, spelled BLAQTRAUMANERD. And you can follow Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights, and you can follow me on Twitter at classical_ideas. Thank you so much to Sacred Rights, and thank you so much for listening. Indhira Udofia, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for inviting me.
I'm so happy that you're here, and I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to the audience and listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and sort of what you do in the world.
So my name is Indhira Udofia. I use she, they pronouns. I am a PhD candidate in the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and North Carolina A&T's Joint Program in Social Work. I am displaying school pride today. I'm actually wearing my school colors. I am currently studying the impact of religious exposure to religious harms on African American millennials and Gen Zers. Also, in my everyday world, I work as a therapist and a consultant. I am the owner of IMU Consulting and Counseling Services, which is a mental health agency therapeutic practice that I started back at the start of the pandemic, which has been a very interesting journey. I really counsel adults who are navigating faith challenges or faith shifts, folks who are recovering from, emotionally immature parents, folks with severe trauma stories and narratives, complex PTSD. It was a natural kind of growing practice. I also work as a consultant through not only my counseling practice, but a nonprofit that I started called Sanctuary Seeking, which serves as a consulting firm for folks who are, and a spiritual coaching firm for folks who are experiencing or trying to navigate creating trauma-informed spaces, whether that's in religious space or in nonprofit space, as well as trying to help folks gain strategies and tools for navigating and healing from religious violence and religious harm.
Talking about listening to you describe your career and your areas of interest specifically, especially with relation to harm and trauma, this is work that is not for the faint of heart. And, I've been reading some of your work recently, and your personal story comes out pretty clearly in a lot of your writing with regards to the topics that you are working in professionally as well. And I'm wondering if there's a specific backstory that you were comfortable sharing with regards to any moments in your life that kind of sent you down this path, and kind of why harm, why trauma in the first place?
It's funny because I'm currently in the dissertating process, and when I'm asked about my topic and kind of why do I care about religious harm, it's because I often say that it comes from a homesickness for a place that I've never been. And so, I grew up in church space. My half of my on my mother's side, half of my family are Pentecostals, the other half are like bona fide Baptists. We have a contingent of Muslim cousins and stuff. I know intimately how much the church is like an intimate partner within all of our stories. And growing up Black and queer, and fat and femme, even, there were often times where I never really fully got to experience the kind of embrace or the kind of fictional aspirational kind of mission of the Black church as a Black person, right? I always felt like I was on the margins of the margins. And so it started as kind of like a curiosity of, why do I not feel like I'm as protected as some of my colleagues? It became real when my brother was around the age of 5 and articulated a call to ministry. And seeing my brother navigate the process of, trying to find mentorship, trying to obtain licensure and ordination, and having a very, really violent experience when I was in seminary just cemented me on my path towards kind of studying this harm. I tell this story to all of my friends, but like I got kicked out of the church my second year of seminary for
Wow.
disagreeing about showing up to a meeting, knowing that I was currently in field education and I couldn't make it. My faith leader at the time sent me an email that threw a lot of my harm back at me, some of my experiences in my past back at me, said I was threatening to leave. And so I was no longer covered. And that moment of rupture really cemented this path, because I kept searching for resources and kept searching for tools that just did not exist that could speak directly to my context.
Interesting. Okay, cool. That really makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad to know it. So then you go on this academic journey. Tell me a little bit about some of your academic stepping stones that you've traveled along this this path that you've been on. Who have been some of your stops along the way and some important people?
So, this was all happening while I had the intellectual curiosity first and kind of like little experiences that were nudging at it. But I was already in seminary by the time I started. So when I graduated from undergrad with my WGS major, I was looking a lot around domestic violence and the Black church's response to domestic violence. I was a child who kind of grew up purity culture adjacent. And I say adjacent because my major models for understanding Black purity culture did not come from like a Joshua Harris. I took True Love Waits, but we were listening to Juanita Bynum's No More Sheets, or, T.D. Jakes' Woman Thou Art Loose. It was a different type of cultural roadmap for understanding how to perform Black femininity. Growing up, knowing that that wasn't not my thing, I often was trying to find counter narratives. And so pop culture became a place that I could and cultural studies became kind of like the place that I started to play. And so I read a lot of bell hooks when I was in grad school, and Audre Lorde. I, started really kind of starting to sharpen my tools. So by the time I had graduated Duke, I had a really good kind of idea based off of some of the teaching from Dr. Ebony Marshall Turman and Dr. Willie Jennings and Dr. J. Cameron Carter, who kind of helped me develop a actual viable Black theology. Because coming from charismatic backgrounds, those were not the kind of fundamental Christian education experiences I had in church space. And so once I kind of learned the language of the faith, I went to Boston University and studied underneath Dr. Pamela Lightsey and Dr. Shelley Rambo to kind of continue my work, which is kind of the piece that I offered you was from that experience.
Yeah.
And so I really got into queer theory. And so Jack Campbell's was a really good, The Queer Art of Failure is probably one of the premier texts that I use to kind of, not only in my academic work, but even in my therapeutic work, really incorporating this idea of play and failure as a project of kind of understanding and healing and navigating trauma. And now, of course, Dr. Rambo's Spirit of Trauma was a really big influential piece. And so as I kind of got back into the social work sphere, which is where I'm getting my PhD, I've really been engaging with Du Bois, a lot of art-based pedagogies and research, and just really trying to mesh all my worlds together.
I want to know a little bit about your company as well. We'll talk about your scholarship in just a few minutes because I'm super interested to get there too. But I know that you have a business, IMU Consulting and Counseling, which you mentioned just a few minutes ago. And some of your specialties within that business are things I've never talked about on the podcast at all. And I love hearing new things. And I know that these are all subfields in and of themselves with vast bodies of research behind them. But you write on the website about trauma-formed cognitive behavioral therapy, brain spotting, narrative therapy, and decolonial indigenous-based healing modalities. And I'm wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about the mission of the business itself, and maybe some of these things that I'm just mentioning at you out of nowhere.
Yeah. So the premise of my practice is very simple. We practice the anti-oppressive framework that is trying to decolonize mental health by addressing the fact that there are already ancestral practices, wisdoms, and teachings that can kind of help undergird. So I use a kind of framework, a healing-centered framework that has been introduced by Sean Ginwright, which talks about the idea of spirituality, culture, and collective action being a vital part of how we understand healing work. And so my therapy practice is a way to practice that in a therapeutic setting. And so I started training in cognitive behavioral therapy when I fresh out of kind of like my preliminary licensure phase, and started doing it when I was obtaining my social work license. And so trauma-formed CBT is actually a specific modality that is catered towards youth. So from 0 to 18 are kind of the ideal candidates for that modality. And what it does is it helps children to begin to work through a trauma narrative using art, using psychoeducation, and it's a family system model. So I work with the parents, I work with the youth, I work with them individually and collectively, very extensively through kind of a course of 6 months. And I kind of help them begin to process and tools. So we start with just psychoeducation. What does trauma do, right? What is trauma doing in this particular case? Then we talk about resourcing. What are some of the tools that we can help to decompress so that when we are stewing it, and the whole time I'm working with the youth, I'm working on them being able to share their story. So whether that's, writing out a trauma narrative, whether that's, illustrating, whether that's just talking through play therapy, there are multiple ways that I can engage based off of the age of the child to begin for them to be able to embody it. And I work with the parents for not being hyper reactionary in the midst of sharing that story, right? How do we prepare an environment that's safe enough for them to hold space for the story? Because often children are not apt to talk about things that have harmed them out of the fear of the parents' responses to it. And so it's a way to kind of just begin to kind of do a family systems approach to kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. So
Gotcha.
That's
yeah.
I know I sound like a nerd, but just go with me. So
it's wonderful. I love it. I'm having a blast.
So brain spotting is an applied theory from using the polygonal theory, which is kind of a long kind of the kind of short condensed version is often the way where you look is how you feel. So it's kind of akin to EMDR, but instead of it being more clinician led, where the clinician controls the activation and the triggering and the de-escalation process, all of that is client led. And this is kind of tying into some of the kind of spiritual indigenous practicing, right, of just like holding space and bearing witness. And so I use a pointer. I don't have my pointer on me, but I have a pointer and normally have colorful balls or like little erasers on top. And I'm like asking them to look at a point. I'm asking them to think about an event, see where it shows up in their body, kind of rank the activation scale. And then I ask them to just sit and look and allow their body to inform what happens next. And the thing about brain spotting is that it is so powerful to see people activate and come to conclusions or make connections in real time. So I normally do those for like 45 minutes. And then we have the last 15, 20 minutes of just like decompressing about what we've heard, what we've acknowledged, some homework or reflection exercises that they can take. And then I use narrative and decolonial therapy kind of together. The main question in my kind of narrative approach is, what are the stories that are informing the kind of belief patterns that you have, right? Like where are these scripts coming from that are informing, or what are these rules that we're abiding by? Where did those narratives start for you? And what are the disruptive narratives or responses that you can offer in order to be able to do it? Those narrative form is very helpful for my religious trauma clients, obviously, because, as they're, unpacking things like shame and sin and evil and good, being able to point it back and actually reclaim certain narratives that are actually helpful and discard harmful narratives and reconstruct those things have been very powerful tools in my kind of therapeutic practice.
Amazing. That sounds like incredible work. And, and you're doing a dissertation all at the same time. And I was looking at the topic of your dissertation, the impact of religious trauma on Black millennials and Gen Z. And then you explore the impact of institutional violence on gendered and sexual minorities within Black religious spaces. How did you land on this particular topic? How did you take all of the worlds that you're involved in and hone it into this one particular sort of population and topic?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is birthed from personal experience, right? Like experiencing that rupture of community when I was in seminary was deeply disorienting. And it really challenged my kind of assumption. And so it started in my master's program. So my senior thesis for my dual degree, because I got my degree from Duke and Carolina at the same time, was looking at the exposure to harm and its impact on vocational identity development for Black clergy folks. So it started there. And then I started looking at data around clergy people and understanding that within, the first 5 years of ministry, 90% of folks end up leaving their pulpit space. And then I started looking at my friends who I went to seminary with and how many of those folks are either not pastoring, not really excited about being a pastor, or, just experiencing a lot of chaos and negativity within ecclesial space. And so it was a natural progression from just kind of these questions around how the church serves as an intimate partner and how that intimate partner can be very harmful. By the time I had gotten to seminary, I had spent 5 years between my last degree. And so I was working in the field, working in intensive in home, which is a community mental health program in Virginia that caters to adolescents and youth. And so I was working with kids as young as 3 and as old. And I think the oldest client I had was like 21. And I just kept hearing I would have to see them for therapy at least once a month. And then I would do treatment team plannings with their family systems. And what kept coming up as I was like, navigating or, working in this kind of rural space was how much power the church had, and that the church was just not holding these youth in the way that they needed to be held. There's a story that I kind of tell often in my training sessions about how when I was in, it was probably my last year of community mental health practice. I was working with the family system, and the youth had a psychotic crisis the night before, and it was time for our kind of follow-up session. And basically I got a call maybe an hour before the follow-up session, like, hey, I'm going to have to cancel. The pastor's coming over to do an exorcism. The person didn't need an exorcism. The person needed their abuser to be held accountable.
Yeah.
Right. And so that really had me thinking that I had to go back to school to kind of begin to really realize, because I would talk to my clinical supervisors, people with 20, 30 years of experience, and they were like, more about this than I do. Like there was no kind of roadmap. There were no resources that I could really point to. And then the ones that I did find, they were overwhelmingly from a white evangelical perspective. And I just realized that when you're working with people of color, especially Black people, right? The ways in which we understand faith and religion, the way we do faith and religion looks completely different. And those cultural touchstones or those kind of references don't relate, which means they don't land, and we don't have the same level of resourcing as some of our white colleagues.
Interesting. Yeah. So let's dive into what this looks like in your work too. So you did send me a piece that I read the other day called Embracing the Lady, Conjuring Black Womanhood in Historical Trauma and Haunting Presence. Tell me a little bit about the backstory of this piece, and then we'll dive into some of the specifics.
Yeah, so when I was at BU, I was studying, I went to go get my master's of sacred theology. And so I really was, at that point, I was really looking at purity culture as kind of a site of entry to begin to explore these topics around religious harm and religious violence. Coming from a WGS background, after kind of having conversations with some colleagues and friends of mine around the fact that, like, I don't know who Joshua Harris is. Like I did not grow up with him. And so when I would talk to some of my white colleagues around purity culture, they had all these salient references around, people and things that I could not access. And so my question was, how do I begin to translate and create and build kind of the typology of purity culture within Black church spaces? Because not all Black churches are going to use white evangelicalism or white evangelical resources. We have our own, right? And so it started with a kind of a cheeky kind of dig at TD Jakes' Her Lady, Her Lover, Her Lord, which if you've never read the book, you don't have to. There's sermons. Back in like the early 2000s, he had a erotic gospel album called Sacred Love Sounds. And so I used to joke it was like me and two friends, we used to joke and call ourselves the Bynum Caucus, because we would always look at these kind of like Black cultural church cultural productions as a way to kind of enter conversations around sexual ethics and theology and, all the things. So that was what it starts. So what you read was the first chapter of what was supposed to be kind of like a 3-chapter thesis. And I got to chapter 2 and it was like, I could just take my comps and finish. And so I did, but it's one of my most favorite pieces that I ever created. It's something that I'm going to come back to. I'm just trying to figure out how.
I want to know about what your experience is with purity culture lessons. You mentioned some program name earlier that I hadn't heard of. And then you've also said the name Juanita Bynum a little bit, and Bynum comes up in your piece as well. But what's your experience about, growing up and being exposed to sexual purity lessons in religious communities?
So I'm a weird case because my mom was an HIV case manager for 25 years. And so when I was born, I actually grew up in a pretty sex positive household. My mom was always like, well, I wish you would wait. If you don't, I just want you to practice safety. And that kind of was the kind of rule of my house. But then we would go into church space and youth group would have their own messages that I would then have to kind of like sort through. I was about 10 years old and we were starting True Love Waits in our youth group. And I tell this story and it's actually kind of hilarious. But so when we did the True Love Waits, I grew up as a kind of like the tomboy of my group. I was burping my ABCs, I really wasn't seeing it for guys. I was always queer, just didn't quite have language. And so I remember sitting in True Love Waits class and they were talking about desire. And I just could not wrap my brain around how anyone could feel that way about a boy. I just couldn't. Like, it was just one of those things where like I registered, we got to the end of the curriculum and we could have gotten a promise ring. It was like, you could participate in this promise ring ceremony. And my dad was like, you're not going to want to wear a dress. Don't worry about it. And my mom was very much in agreement. So, it had mercy on me.
Yeah.
But about 2 weeks later, the co-facilitators announced that they were not married. So I always kind of thought purity culture was this big giant joke that we are all in on. Like, we take the classes, we say wait till marriage and wink, wink. It wasn't
Right.
until I was actually kind of coming out of undergrad, coming out of like my first undergrad experience, coming back home, and like starting school again, that I realized that people were taking it seriously. And I just thought it was very odd because, by then I was 22, to entering into 24. I was participating in like singles ministry. I was working as a youth pastor at the time. And I just kept saying, like, this doesn't make sense given how all the Black people I know are, right? Like, this idea of being demure and soft and performing this rigid femininity just never really made sense to me. And so it started as this like curiosity of like, well, how did we get here? Like, where did this message come from? And if we know this doesn't work, why are we so wedded to the process of it? And that's kind of what started this kind of journey.
You write in your piece as well about the lineage of social messaging related to this field of work, and I'm curious if you have some highlights about the lineage of this purity culture topic that you explore in here. Like, kind of give us a little bit of the backstory around this.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we think about the fact that, if we start examining the project of Black womanhood at the nexus of the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave thing, right? Black women were never women, right? That's why Ain't I a Woman is a thing, right? And so we have these kind of dual experiences of womanhood. And then as we get closer to kind of like the kind of monetarization of the thing, and we talk about civil rights, what we see is this kind of pressure to align one's idea of womanhood to kind of the project of what the idealized white Western model of womanhood and gender expression is. And so part of my work is looking at the fact that maybe, and this is like my hypothesis, right, that maybe part of the reason why folks start wedding, rigid social and gender scripting to kind of the way that we embody and move through the world is a project of survival, right? Like, to be able to move towards what I like to call ontological whiteness, aka holiness, right? Like the holiness codes turn into this kind of model of ontological whiteness that folks aspire to in order to achieve a humanity. So if I am soft enough, if I am demure enough, if I play into the kind of traditional scriptings of femininity, then I have the protection of womanhood. Although it's never ever actually a protection, right? It's only more harm. All safe spaces end up being a prison when it's all said and done, because it shows the fragility of being in and out. And so part of my like work is to kind of think through, what does it look like to have this ancestral wound of trying to prove one's humanity at the core kind of linking of a faith development system.
I think that that also connects to something else that you wrote in the article about something that you say is called the problem of the Black body in the Western social imaginary. And then it ties in the middle passage all the way to the present day. I wonder if you can just say a little bit more about that terminology, about the problem of the Black body in the Western social imaginary, because that was extremely captivating.
Yeah. So I think when we're talking about the problem, right, it's what do we do with humans who are not humans, right? Like when the line for humanity is contingent on a racialized body, we have to answer questions, right? We have to be able to do it. So in a society that is not rooted in the survival of anybody that is not white, the resiliency of Black people inherently creates a problem and a moving target for understanding humanity, and therefore ethical consideration and protection. And so part of the kind of move, as we keep moving the needles of what makes something human, right, as we get closer and closer to whiteness, the fact that we have Black people who are constantly surviving in a system that's not rooted in their survival, it will always mirror the inefficiency of their definitions of humanity, the inefficiency of how we have socially constructed certain systems when we don't want to include a certain body. So Blackness inherently becomes not only a mirror, but also protest that is constantly agitating what it means to actually think of what it means for a person to be a person or a human to be a human.
Yeah, it's like this idea that reminds me of the white like dominant culture oftentimes has this thing of like trying to pound other cultures into being what it is. So it's like this, why won't you just like be just like us and worship us almost in a way. And so that's kind of like what it reminds me of. It's like the problem is that like, why won't you just be exactly what we are instead of being in yourself, instead of being yourself and actually being resilient in that self? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And that's why it's, my fascination around, Black people's investment in these type of systems is so fascinating, because if we think about, even the anti-trans laws that are coming up, the policies, the ways that TERF ideology is riding rampant after, trans folks, Black women are always like second on the list of like being denied womanhood, or cis Black women are the ones that are like next on the chopping block. And it's just like they're waiting for an opportunity to revoke cis women's kind of investment into womanhood or claim to womanhood. And so like when we think about the fact that it is a moving target, and we think about how, you have, Black churches who may purport more transphobic, homophobic ideology, it's actually counterintuitive, because we know that if they actually are attacking, the most marginalized within our space, right? Black and brown, trans and queer people, cis folks are not far behind. It's a slippery slope to be able to practice an exclusionary humanity, and there's no amount of acquiescing that's going to allow it, which is why things like failure and play are so important in kind of the back part of my work.
I want to know about some people that are involved in your work too. The piece that you wrote starts off discussing Juanita Bynum and a sermon titled "No More Sheets." What made you start the piece with the work of Bynum?
Yeah, because that was my Joshua Harris, right? I didn't know anybody else. And I think when I mentioned, it would be a question around like, have you ever heard this term before? And the answer outside of my like academic bubble was no. What is that? But I could identify the markings of purity culture within these kind of sermons and these influence and these ministers and these kind of ministry frameworks. So part of using Bynum and No More Sheets was a way to begin to translate and create the linkage of these kind of two systems, so folks can have a bridge to figure out that we're actually talking about the same thing.
How does purity culture in the churches that you are interested in differ from like purity culture in like white evangelical churches? Are there any major distinctions between the two groups?
I mean, I think one, there's just the actual reference and who is being listened to are drastically different, right? The theological suppositions are not necessarily different, but the way that it's conveyed often presumes a promiscuity that does not exist for white folks. For white folks, it's about protecting the purity of womanhood. A lot of times when we're thinking about purity culture within Black church spaces, the presumption of purity is already lost on the child by the time the child comes in, right? So there's a lot more bodily policing, like, how do we make sure that girls don't look fast, right, in the congregation? How do we make sure if their hips, making sure they have the lap cloth, right, to cover? You're not supposed to wear certain type of things to accentuate your body, because our bodies are shaped a little bit more shapely than, our white counterparts. And so part of it is like a lot more bodied based shame, and the lack of assumption that there's purity at stake. A lot of the conversation was more about, we already know you're fast and you're going to do it, but you should know that if you actually want to be a good girl, you need to do something different, or you need to kind of reverse your trajectory of fastness. That, I think, is a different vantage point than what I've heard some of my colleagues talk about when they talk about growing up in like white Western purity culture.
Something that was jumping out to me when I was reading the piece is there seemed to be like a tone of responsibility for sexual purity being placed squarely upon the shoulders pretty much solely of women. And I'm wondering if I'm reading that accurately or if I'm, conflating that at all.
Yeah, but also I can also say that, like, having a brother who was also deeply religious and desired it, the presumption of purity was solely on women. The beauty of growing up with brothers is that I actually got to see the masculine version of it. Men weren't often talked to truly about, like, what does it mean for men to practice purity? We've named it, but it was really stressed and hyper policed. So I just remember there was one story in particular where my brother was wearing a set of pants that was considered somewhat revealing. It was a little bit tighter around his hips. And I remember the conversation was like my brother's body being a distraction as he's, and my brother was a minor at this point. And so I remember being deeply enraged, one, by just kind of like the presumption of it. But it was more just about, just make sure that you kind of tighten up. For me, when I have entered into pulpit spaces, I was hyper police. I had to show my outfit before I could do it. We were asked to wear robes often to really cover our bodies. And then even the femme identified person who kind of named feeling distracted by my brother's presence, she got a lot less because it was almost assumed that like his body was supposed to conjure some type of sexual availability that my body could not hold, which I found deeply distressing. And so part of the kind of politics and how it plays out is that often, yes, men are taught to be a provider and to practice kind of like, I need to be a provider. I need to, be a man of standard. But what that standard looked like was deeply contingent on what we were able to kind of mold and accountable. We were solely responsible for not only our ethical and moral thing, but to not lead others into sin. So that message was a really big message that I had heard even when I was smaller, but especially by the time I had gotten reintroduced into like church leadership space. I had a lot more conversations about women and how women hold themselves and how women invite danger, invite sex. I had less conversations around men actually being the ones that introduced sex as an option. I've dealt with predominantly, the assumption of cis normative relationships.
Throughout your writing, tend to throw in like references to pop culture, music, song lyrics. And it's really cool to see the ways that you, in the profession that you're in, notice things in performance art that grab your attention, because the ways that music speaks to people in the world is different based on all of our own lived experiences. So to see you in the counseling profession picking up on certain lyrics and songs and stuff like that is really cool, because it will hit you in ways that it won't hit people who aren't in that profession. Tell me a little bit about this aspect of your work of tying in like performance art and music into your own writing.
It actually started because I was kind of frustrated because I saw the phenomenon and no one else did, right? And so when I would try to explain it to people who maybe were outside of the theology bubble or even the therapeutic bubble, people couldn't always connect the pieces. And so what I kind of use, like, especially when I'm thinking about music, what I try to do with art is, if you can't intellectually connect, there's a somatic response that gets conjured up when we experience art. And so you may not intellectually be able to articulate an experience, but if I give you a music, it can conjure up a somatic response so you can connect to the words that I'm saying. And so it started as a way for me to begin to explain to my family members and my friends what I was actually studying, because I would talk all the things and drop all the gems, and they kind of would just look like, okay,
Very overwhelming.
yes, it's very overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And so it started with this actual project, what do Black femmes who have either intersected with this space, have touched this space, have been shaped by this space, how do they now see the world now that they've interacted with this system? I use music as a way to maybe spring specters of what are the kind of ghosts that are haunting us after we interact with this space, right? What are the lingering presence or specters, right, that show up in the ways that we relate to one another? And so the kind of haunting piece was the music, right? Like being able to talk about this kind of fatigue and weariness of having to be everything to everyone. That is something that people can universally connect to. How that now relates to how we understand Black womanhood's contortions performance in purity culture now has a language, or has that I can now connect to. So the this kind of song movements and the poetry that I used in that particular piece were ways to prep the reader for the somatic and emotional responses to what I am intellectually trying to describe, so that they can actually have a pinpoint and relate to the work a little bit easier.
Do you have any like writers that are kind of like your go-to in the field of like trauma and faith-based communities that you would recommend that everybody out there listening who's really into this topic to go and read for themselves as well?
Yeah. So, I've read a lot of faith memoirs. So like my whole dissertation, my whole like master's thesis had been reading memoirs. And so I read a lot of Rachel Held Evans. I read Barbara Brown Taylor, but I also read a lot of womanist thinkers, Stacey Floyd Thomas, Minding the Mother Load, Renita Weems, Just a Prayer Away, Bipolar Faith by Monica Coleman. Recently, I've been kind of trying to expand my canon and do things that are not just centered around like queerness and stuff. I recently read the Theology by Candace Bimbo, and having conversations with her and folks who have read the book, seeing how they are connecting the dots and starting to be able to identify their experiences of harm within the spaces has been really, refreshing and helpful. I follow a lot of people on social media. So I follow Kristen Smith and the kind of what is it, Cigars and Christianity podcast, I think is the name of the podcast. I follow Unfit Christian. For a while, I really followed and engaged J.T. Perry's work around like erotic asceticism and spirituality and like integration of African traditional beliefs in Christianity. I'm a big follower of Melva Sampson's Pink Robe Chronicles. Like there are a lot of people that I've kind of just have been listening and watching them practice this kind of fluidity and reclamation work that's been really inspiring for me as I'm like developing my own style in writing.
Your writing, the goal is to become a more public facing author in the coming years. I know that because you are in the Carpenter cohort for the Sacred Rights 2023 Public Scholarship and Religion Trainings. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on why it's important for you to get your work more out in the public sphere.
Yeah, I say this all the time. I'm developing resources I wish I had in seminary. And I know that part of that means that I have to be perceived publicly to do so. It's really important as a social worker, we're really contingent on intervention building and like solutions and building resources. And I know that not everyone is going to have the privilege to sit and think for 12 years about a particular topic. They'll need answers right away. And so it is just very helpful to be able to engage folks and to translate what I'm thinking that I've been thinking about for a while and seeing the need for it in the ways that things are showing up in policy and being able to identify like, hey, this like Christian nationalist thing, this is our business too. Let's tap into this a little bit more. And so it's just a way to kind of do it. I often say that if I can't convince my 82-year-old grandmother that I still love God and I'm still at least culturally Baptist, then I'm doing something wrong in my writing.
Gotcha. I'm wondering how the trainings are going for you to, you already are publicly involved. You mentioned that you've been on podcasts and things like that. So this is not a brand new field for you, but how are you feeling yourself growing with your own skills in relation to what you're going through in the training cohorts?
Yeah, the trainings have been really helpful because I am someone who really is bad about showing what I'm doing. I'll do things off of a whim, but I won't really like actually share with people where my brain is. And it was really important to me when I was developing the dissertation to have something that was more public facing attached to it. And so this has been really helpful to also kind of get me out of my way to see like what the blockage is when it comes to the stuff. I'm very capable, but sometimes I think, the curse of going to multiple grad programs is that after a while you start getting a little bit shy around your stuff because you want to make sure it's right. And so as a recovering perfectionist, I'm really trying to learn how to be just more open and fluid and trusting myself, which the trainings have really helped me think through.
Awesome. Well, I know that Dr. Liz Buchar talks a lot about risks, rewards, and responsibilities of being a publicly engaged scholar. Your work is in a field where you have to have a considerable amount of bravery to speak out forcefully on these types of things. What are some of your reflections so far on the whole like risks and rewards and responsibilities doing public scholarship, especially in trauma healing in religious communities?
Yeah, so the risks are great. You know, I've had friends who've been blocked by some of these people that I wouldn't like to study. Some of these cultural productions of religious violence, right, within our communities. I've seen the bad parts of being doxxed, and those are definitely big risks that I think about, which has also made me very hesitant, right, about actually having a profile that is truly public facing. But I think the rewards is that there's just so many, we talk about the growing numbers of nuns, especially within Black religious space, right? We talk about folks who, are culturally connected to institutions, but can't participate in the life of the communities because of harm. And I see how not talking about these things or not having resources or not being able to name certain things have deeply shaped not only their abilities to connect with community and belonging, but also they're often taking their harm and transposing it into other systems and creating more harm, right? And so the work of public scholarship for me is an act of trying to stop the bleeding, right? Like we begin to kind of clean out these wounds and suture them so that we can actually have religious and spiritual lives that are not effectively a trauma bond response. That's really deeply important to me. I want people to have relationships that don't exist simply because they feel like they have to, or there's no other place that they can be. And exposing themselves to harm to stay in those spaces is just not a world I want to live in. And so that's kind of my responsibility is to be able to create the conditions, not only for people to find sanctuary from harm, but to stop the conditions of harm to begin with.
What are you enjoying about working with the cohort and the training so far?
I have deeply enjoyed just getting to know people's work and just the various kind of perspectives that they have. Coming from a non-religious PhD program, I've missed being in conversation with folks who are religious nerds. And so it's just been helpful to just be among people who really deeply care about their communities, hearing other perspectives, seeing people who are in various aspects of their journey, still wrestling with the same thing. How do I translate this experience? I see this need, but how do I publicly address this need in a way that's accessible? And folks just keep me very inspired and keep me really, really inspired about what the possibilities may look like.
Indira, I have absolutely loved this conversation today. I have learned so much, and I am so excited about the future of reading your work in whatever publications put out your work in the future. And I'm wondering if you have a place or suggestions for where people can go if they would like to follow along with what it is that you're doing.
Yes. So you can always go to my website, www.iamudofia.com. It's kind of like my portfolio page mixed with like my landing page for my other kind of ventures. You can also find me on Twitter as long as Twitter exists, at Black BLAQ Trauma Nerd, all one word. That is actually where I will be doing a lot of my data analysis, which I'm getting very close to doing. I'm very excited about that. I'm trying to do some kind of digital work where I'm kind of interacting with kind of what I'm seeing in my data, starting that process of translation. And yeah, you follow those two places, you and Facebook, Indhira Udofia. If you follow those three places, you'll probably get an idea of what I'm up to.
Amazing. Well, Indhira Udofia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate your time, your energy, and learning with you today.
Thank you so much.